Welcome to Dark Hour Tales. Tonight's tale is The Silent Climber. Callum first noticed the stranger standing among the trees below them, completely motionless in falling snow and looking directly up the mountain, while Robyn was tightening one of the straps on her pack several meters ahead. There was nothing immediately alarming about seeing another climber in that part of the Canadian Rockies, because although they had deliberately chosen a quieter route away from the busiest trails, they had already encountered two other groups earlier in the day. Something about this man made Callum watch him longer than he normally would have, however, because he did not appear to be climbing, resting, or studying the terrain. He simply stood between two snow-covered pines in a faded red climbing jacket, his face too distant to make out properly, and seemed to be staring directly towards them. Callum called Robyn back and pointed down the slope, and after watching the man for several seconds, she suggested he might be waiting for somebody farther behind. Callum agreed, because there was no reason to assume anything stranger, and when he raised one arm in greeting, the man neither waved nor moved. The two friends continued upwards, occasionally glancing back until the trees and falling snow eventually concealed the red jacket. 43 minutes later, Robyn stopped so abruptly that Callum nearly walked into the back of her. She pointed towards a rocky ridge considerably higher up the route, where a narrow section of trail curved around an exposed wall before disappearing from view, and Callum immediately recognized the same faded red jacket. The stranger was standing nearly half a mile ahead of them, facing back down the mountain with the same unnerving stillness. Neither Callum nor Robyn had seen him pass, and the terrain they had crossed since the first sighting contained no obvious alternative route that could have allowed somebody to overtake them unnoticed. Robyn suggested that a local climber might know shortcuts omitted from their map, which was entirely possible in an area crossed by old forestry tracks and unofficial routes, but even she sounded unconvinced when Callum pointed out how quickly the man would have needed to move. They shouted a greeting together, hoping for any normal response that would make the situation feel less peculiar, yet the stranger simply watched them before turning and walking behind the ridge. When Callum and Robyn reached the same position 20 minutes later, there was no sign of him anywhere ahead. They continued climbing while discussing the encounter without allowing it to dominate the day. Both were experienced enough outdoors to understand how misleading distance and terrain could be, particularly on a mountain where a route invisible from one position might become obvious from another, and neither wanted to turn an odd stranger into something frightening simply because he was antisocial. The weather remained manageable despite increasing cloud, and their equipment was appropriate for conditions expected to deteriorate later in the afternoon. Robyn checked their route against the GPS while Callum studied the surrounding slopes, and for almost an hour they saw nobody else. The next sighting occurred after they stopped beside a sheltered rock formation to drink and eat something, when Robyn noticed a flash of red farther uphill. The stranger stood on another section of trail and appeared to be watching them again. This time Callum deliberately remained where he was rather than immediately continuing, and the man did the same. 5 minutes passed, then 10, while snow accumulated on the stranger's shoulders without him making any visible attempt to brush it away. When Callum and Robyn finally started moving, the man turned and disappeared ahead. The pattern repeated twice during the following hour, and by the second occurrence neither of them was interested in explaining it away. Whenever they stopped for more than a few minutes, the red-jacketed climber seemed to stop somewhere ahead or behind them, and whenever they resumed travelling, he eventually disappeared before appearing again in another position. He never approached closely enough for them to see his face properly, and never answered when they called to him. The worsening weather added urgency, because cloud was descending over the upper slopes, and snowfall had begun thickening, leaving Callum and Robyn increasingly uncomfortable with the idea of eventually having to pass a stranger who appeared to be deliberately tracking their movement. When the man appeared again farther ahead on the route, standing near a narrow section they would need to cross, Robyn suggested using an alternative descent marked on their map. Under ordinary conditions, the route would reconnect with a lower trail and add less than an hour to their return. And although neither liked changing plans with the weather deteriorating, avoiding the silent man seemed safer than walking directly towards him. They turned away from the main route and began descending across a broad slope where snow had already started filling older footprints. For the first 20 minutes, the decision seemed to have worked because the stranger did not appear behind them, and both began relaxing enough to joke about how ridiculous the whole situation might sound later. The alternative path became less obvious as visibility worsened, but their GPS still placed them correctly, and Robyn regularly checked their bearing against the map. Trouble began when the terrain forced them farther west around a steep exposed section that looked considerably less stable under fresh snow than the map suggested. Returning would have required climbing back towards the area where they last saw the stranger, while continuing downhill should eventually bring them into forest where the trees would at least provide protection from the wind. Callum and Robyn chose the lower ground, moving carefully as snow reduced visibility to little more than the surrounding rocks and scattered trees. Callum saw the red jacket again shortly before they entered the forest. The stranger stood among the trees below them, already positioned on the route they were approaching, despite having last been seen far above and on the opposite side of the ridge. Callum stopped and grabbed Robyn's arm before pointing him out, and neither attempted to explain how he had reached the lower forest ahead of them. The man remained still until they changed direction, then disappeared behind the trees without pursuing. Robyn looked at their map and said what Callum had already begun suspecting, which was that the stranger seemed to know where every decision would lead them. They had assumed they were escaping him by leaving the main trail, but the possibility now existed that their decision to change routes had been exactly what he wanted. The forest protected them from the worst of the wind while creating a different problem because visibility between the trees became increasingly poor. Callum and Robyn stayed close together and followed their compass rather than relying entirely on the GPS, aiming towards lower terrain where they expected to intersect another marked route. Every so often, one of them caught sight of the stranger through the snowfall, always far enough away that chasing or confronting him would have been pointless. He never rushed towards them and never attempted to hide completely because his presence seemed designed to be noticed. When Callum and Robyn altered direction sharply towards the east, they travelled for almost 20 minutes without seeing him and began wondering whether they had finally broken whatever pattern he was following. Then Robyn found footprints crossing the snow ahead of them. The tracks did not follow their route from behind, but crossed it from one side of the forest to the other, and the size and tread appeared consistent with the boots they had glimpsed on the stranger. He had not followed their new direction after they chose it. He had somehow anticipated where they were going and crossed ahead of them. By late afternoon, the situation had become dangerous, regardless of the stranger. Snowfall was heavier than forecast, daylight was fading, and the temperature had dropped sharply enough that remaining exposed overnight would carry a genuine risk of hypothermia. Callum and Robyn discussed turning back, but rejected the idea because retracing several hours through increasingly obscured terrain would leave them climbing uphill in darkness. They instead continued towards a lower section of forest where their map suggested an old service route might exist, and shortly afterwards Robyn noticed the shape of a roof through the trees. The small wooden cabin appeared abandoned from a distance, with snow piled against one wall and no smoke rising from the chimney. But the door opened without resistance, and the interior immediately offered more shelter than anything they were likely to find before nightfall. The cabin was basic but surprisingly usable. An old iron stove occupied one corner, dry firewood had been stacked nearby, and several blankets remained folded on shelves along the wall. There were tins of food, a small amount of bottled water, and enough evidence of occasional human use that Callum initially assumed they had found an unofficial emergency shelter maintained by local climbers or forestry workers. They removed wet outer layers, started the stove and contacted emergency services while they still had intermittent signal, giving their approximate location and explaining that deteriorating conditions had forced them away from their intended route. They also mentioned the stranger, although describing a silent climber who repeatedly appeared around them sounded far less convincing once they were warm and inside. The operator advised them to remain sheltered if the cabin was secure, conserve battery power, and make no unnecessary attempt to travel through the storm until conditions improved or rescuers could reach the area. For nearly half an hour, the cabin felt like the first piece of good fortune they had encountered since leaving the main route. Robyn found an old kettle while Callum checked the windows and made sure the door could be secured, and both began believing they could simply wait until morning. That changed when Robyn noticed a good quality climbing glove beneath one of the benches. A single lost glove meant nothing, but Callum then found snow goggles in a drawer, followed by an expensive handheld GPS unit with a dead battery. Beneath another bench sat a backpack containing clothing far newer than the cabin itself, while a second pack stored in a cupboard belonged to a completely different manufacturer and size. Their curiosity turned into unease as they searched more carefully and discovered boots, watches, wallets, cameras, maps, and pieces of climbing equipment accumulated in storage spaces throughout the building. The objects were not displayed or organized like trophies, which somehow made them worse because they looked as though somebody had simply collected possessions over many years and stored them wherever space remained. Robyn opened one of the wallets and found identification belonging to a climber whose name she recognized from a missing person notice they had seen while researching conditions before their trip. The man had disappeared in the region 2 years earlier and had never been found. Callum searched another pack and discovered identification belonging to a woman reported missing nearly a decade before, while a small notebook contained a third name that Robyn recognized from an article about unexplained disappearances in the Rockies. The cabin suddenly stopped feeling like an emergency shelter and became somewhere neither of them wanted to remain. Callum photographed everything they could without disturbing more than necessary, while Robyn tried their phone again and managed to send several images and their approximate location before the signal disappeared completely. Callum was examining an old map pinned inside a cupboard when Robyn moved towards the nearest window and became silent. The stranger stood at the edge of the tree line, perhaps 50 meters from the cabin, his red jacket visible through the falling snow and his body facing directly towards them. He made no attempt to approach, and for the first time the distance was short enough for Callum to notice how old the jacket appeared. The red fabric had faded unevenly, and several sections were repaired with mismatched material, while the man's pack looked similarly worn. They watched him for almost a minute before Robyn quietly observed that they had spent hours believing they were escaping him, yet every decision they made had eventually brought them to this cabin. The implication was difficult to dismiss, because the stranger had repeatedly positioned himself in ways that encouraged them away from one direction and towards another. They had not discovered his cabin while fleeing from him. He appeared to have guided them there. The maps inside the cupboard made that possibility considerably worse. Several routes across the surrounding mountains had been marked in pencil, with dates written beside locations far from established trails. Callum compared some of them against names from the belongings and realized that at least 2 dates corresponded closely with known disappearances. There were no bodies inside the cabin and nothing that looked like a place where people had been imprisoned, which suggested a method far more difficult to prove. The stranger did not necessarily need to attack climbers himself if he could frighten them away from safe routes during dangerous weather, because the mountain could kill through exposure, falls, and disorientation without leaving obvious evidence of another person's involvement. The possessions might simply have been collected after victims died somewhere rescuers never searched. Robyn found the first evidence that made a purely human explanation difficult while searching an older backpack for anything identifying its owner. Inside was a weathered notebook containing entries written by a climber who disappeared decades earlier, and the final pages described a man following the group through the forest. The writer repeatedly mentioned a faded red jacket, long periods of silent observation, and the disturbing way the stranger appeared ahead, despite never passing them. One entry described changing routes specifically to avoid him, followed by the discovery that he was already waiting farther down the mountain. Callum and Robyn read the passage twice because it described almost exactly what had happened to them that afternoon. Another storage box contained old photographs and undeveloped film canisters, most apparently collected from missing climbers. One photograph, dated 1974, showed a small climbing group posing near the tree line during clearer weather. The people in the foreground were smiling towards the camera, but a distant figure stood among the trees behind them, wearing a red jacket. A handwritten note on the reverse identified several members of the expedition, including a 19-year-old climber named John Connors, who disappeared during that trip and was never recovered. The quality of the photograph made it impossible to identify the distant figure with certainty, although the posture and clothing were uncomfortably similar to the man standing outside the cabin nearly half a century later. Darkness settled quickly while the storm continued, leaving Callum and Robyn with an increasingly unpleasant decision. Leaving immediately meant travelling through unfamiliar mountain forest at night during heavy snow, but remaining inside a building apparently connected to multiple disappearances meant trusting a locked wooden door against somebody who knew the area far better than they did. They secured the entrance, kept the stove burning, and identified a rear window large enough to use if they needed another exit. Callum studied the map, while Robyn checked their compass and calculated a route towards lower ground where a drainage channel should eventually intersect a forestry track. They agreed to leave as soon as visibility improved enough to move safely, even if that happened before dawn. The first footsteps outside came shortly after 7 in the evening. Snow compressed slowly beneath boots moving along the front wall before stopping beside the window, and Callum extinguished their brighter light while Robyn moved away from the glass. The footsteps resumed after nearly a minute, travelling around the side of the cabin before stopping again behind them. There was no attempt to force the door and no voice demanding entry, which made the deliberate patience outside increasingly difficult to tolerate. The man completed another slow circuit of the building, and then disappeared into silence long enough for Callum to wonder whether he had moved away completely. Robyn checked their equipment while they waited and suddenly realized that both handheld GPS units were missing from the place where they had left them beside the packs. Neither had heard the door open and neither had moved the GPS units. They searched the immediate area before considering the possibility that somebody had entered without using the front entrance, and Callum began examining the cabin more carefully. Behind a low storage cabinet, partially concealed beneath an old floor covering, they found a narrow hatch leading into a shallow service space beneath the building. Fresh snow had melted around the inner edge, leaving damp marks on timber that should have been dry. The stranger had another way inside, and he had already used it while they believed the locked door was protecting them. Callum and Robyn moved the heaviest furniture they could manage across the hatch and prepared to leave through the rear window rather than waiting for another attempt. Before they finished, something struck the underside of the floor hard enough to move the cabinet several centimeters. A second impact followed, then another, while the timber hatch began lifting beneath the weight of the furniture. Callum pushed against the cabinet, while Robyn opened the rear window and lowered their packs outside, but the stranger continued forcing his way upwards with patient strength rather than frantic violence. The hatch finally shifted enough for one hand to appear through the opening, and Callum saw an ordinary human hand covered by a worn climbing glove before the cabinet moved again. There was no monstrous claw or impossible limb to make what followed easier to understand, because the person entering the cabin looked exactly like the man they had seen all day. They escaped through the rear window and moved immediately into the forest, following the compass bearing they had agreed upon rather than allowing panic to choose their direction. Snow reached well above their ankles in places, and darkness reduced the surrounding trees to narrow shapes illuminated by their head torches, while the storm swallowed most sound beyond a few meters. Callum and Robyn stayed within arm's reach whenever terrain allowed, regularly confirming their bearing and refusing to separate even when movement behind them suggested the stranger was gaining ground. The red jacket appeared once between trees and vanished again, but the man never shouted or demanded they stop. He continued the same silent pursuit he had maintained from the beginning. The ground steepened unexpectedly near a concealed drop where fresh snow covered loose rock, and Callum's footing disappeared beneath him while crossing the slope. He slid several meters before the rope connecting him to Robyn tightened, dragging her towards the edge until she dropped her weight and managed to secure herself against a thick tree. Callum stopped with one leg hanging over a much steeper section below and used the rope to regain stable ground while Robyn held position despite the strain until he reached her. They had barely recovered when a figure appeared uphill between the trees, standing close enough that the faded red jacket was unmistakable. Callum and Robyn continued before the man could close the distance, descending towards the drainage channel where the map suggested terrain would become easier. Several hundred meters farther down, Robyn had her own close call when snow collapsed beneath 1 foot near an exposed section of rock and sent her sideways towards a narrow ravine. Callum caught the back of her harness and anchored himself against the slope long enough for her to recover, after which both were breathing too heavily to pretend exhaustion was not becoming dangerous. The stranger appeared again above them, considerably closer than before, and for the first time they could see part of his face beneath his hood. He looked like an ordinary man somewhere around 40, weathered by years outdoors but not elderly, and his expression contained no obvious anger or excitement. He simply watched until Callum and Robyn moved again. Their route eventually reached a section of unstable snow crossing a steep open slope. Travelling over it was risky, but returning towards the stranger seemed worse, and Robyn identified a narrow line near exposed rock where the snowpack appeared firmer. They crossed one at a time, using every precaution they could manage, then looked back to see the silent climber standing at the edge of the same section. For the first time all night he did not follow. He remained motionless while Callum and Robyn continued towards lower ground, as though even he respected the danger of crossing under those conditions. They reached the drainage channel shortly before midnight and followed it until finding enough shelter among dense trees to deploy their emergency bivouac equipment. Continuing while exhausted would have created more danger than remaining still, so they insulated themselves as well as possible and spent the remainder of the night taking turns listening for movement. The storm gradually weakened towards morning, and neither saw the red jacket again. Search and rescue personnel located them after daylight, using the location information they had managed to transmit from the cabin and the route estimates provided before their signal disappeared. Both were exhausted and mildly affected by the cold, but otherwise alive, and the photographs on their phones ensured that their account of the cabin received far more attention than a story about a strange climber normally would have. A search team reached the cabin later that day and recovered belongings connected to several missing people. Further investigation linked additional equipment to disappearances stretching across decades, reopening cases that had previously appeared unrelated. The marked maps suggested that whoever used the cabin possessed extraordinary knowledge of the surrounding terrain, and searches of several locations eventually recovered human remains in areas where previous rescue operations had never looked. Investigators could not determine whether every death involved deliberate interference, but enough evidence existed to support the possibility that somebody had repeatedly manipulated lost or frightened climbers into dangerous terrain before collecting their possessions. The man in the red jacket was never found. Search teams discovered tracks around the cabin, but worsening weather and overlapping rescue activity made them impossible to follow for long. Callum and Robyn were interviewed separately and gave remarkably consistent descriptions of a man who appeared approximately 40 years old, wore an extensively repaired red climbing jacket, and never spoke, despite following them for hours. Neither claimed that he possessed obviously supernatural abilities, and both acknowledged that an experienced local climber could know routes and shortcuts unavailable on standard maps. The difficulty came when specialists reconstructed the positions recorded during their first two sightings. Travelling directly from the trees where Callum first saw the man to the ridge where Robyn saw him 43 minutes later would have taken an expert climber well over an hour in ideal conditions. No recognised shortcut connected the locations, and several possible direct approaches crossed terrain that would have made travelling faster than Callum and Robyn effectively impossible. Investigators could not prove the sightings involved the same person, but both described identical clothing and behaviour before either understood there was anything unusual about the encounter. The photograph from 1974 created a larger problem. Historical records confirmed that John Connors had been 19 when he disappeared during the expedition shown in the image, and several members of the group reported becoming separated from him during deteriorating weather. His body was never found, leading some investigators to consider whether Connors might somehow have survived and spent decades living around the mountain. That explanation failed almost immediately because the man Callum and Robyn encountered looked approximately 40 rather than 70, and the distant figure in the old photograph could not conclusively be identified as Connors in the first place. The possibility remained that the red-jacketed figure behind the group was somebody else entirely, and that John Connors had simply been another climber who disappeared after encountering him. Further searches through archived reports produced an account that made even that explanation difficult to maintain. In 1958, 16 years before John Connors disappeared, another climbing party experienced trouble in the same wider region. One member vanished while two others reached safety, and notes recovered from their abandoned camp described an unknown man who had been appearing around them for most of the day. The description was brief and contained no useful facial details, but the surviving page mentioned one feature clearly enough to survive decades in storage. The stranger wore a red climbing jacket. Callum and Robyn eventually returned home to Scotland with no explanation for what they had encountered. They knew the cabin was real. The possessions belonged to missing climbers, and somebody had apparently been using knowledge of the mountain to manipulate people away from established routes for many years. What nobody could determine was whether the silent climber was one person, several people, who had somehow continued the same behaviour, a story that had become confused across generations, or something that merely looked human whenever frightened climbers saw it through falling snow. The cabin was eventually dismantled as part of the investigation, and several families finally received answers about relatives whose remains were recovered from remote sections of the mountain. John Connors was not among them. No body matching the man in the faded red jacket was ever found, and no local climber could identify somebody fitting Callum and Robyn's description. The oldest reports remained impossible to connect conclusively, leaving investigators with little more than repeated accounts written by people separated by decades who all described the same behaviour. For Callum, the detail that remained hardest to forget was also the first one he noticed. Long before they became lost, long before they discovered the cabin, and long before either of them had any reason to be frightened, he had watched a man standing motionless among the trees below them. 43 minutes later, Robyn had seen what appeared to be the same man nearly half a mile ahead, in a position mountain specialists later confirmed he could not reasonably have reached without passing them. Everything that happened afterwards could be argued over, reconstructed, or blamed on weather, fear, and a human predator who knew the Rockies better than his victims. Nobody ever explained how the silent climber got ahead of them.